Other computers?
They can.
Okay. I will talk through this. Is this audible?
Yes.
So, thank you. Last week, Christine Lagarde of the IMF complained to Argentina. Argentina claims it has 10% inflation. Others think it's more like 24%. And she says from the IMF side, we had to choose between the yellow card and the red card. We chose the yellow card. If no progress has been made, then the red card will be out. And adds, Argentina is good in football and it certainly understands what we are talking about, implying that they're not so good at economics and politics probably. And indeed, President Fernandez responds, the rich countries don't want partners or friends, they just want employees or subordinates. And we're not going to be anybody's employees or subordinates. We are a free country with dignity and national pride. And inflation. I suppose the theme for the Hot Topics panel this year, the conflict between sovereignty and the financial crisis, is so obviously a hot topic of the day that if anything, it would have to be justified as a topic because the question would be, what can comparative law add to this? We see this, of course, not just in Argentina. We see discussions in the European Union where Greece effectively cedes parts of its sovereignty for a bailout, where Spain tries as hard as they can to avoid having to go into a bailout because of their sovereignty concerns, and where Germany, on the other side, also fears about its sovereignty for having to contribute to the bailout. And we see issues in other countries of the world as well. So this seems then a good topic for the Hot Topics panel in comparative law. You may remember we introduced this last year as an attempt to add something to the general theme of the conference, to talk about another paper, and to test what comparative law can say about actual hot topics of the day, and on the other hand, of course, to test how comparative law might have to adapt in order to have a lot to say and be relevant to these topics. To do this year, as you all know, we made a call for papers to the members of the society and also to others, trying to see by that whether comparative law has something additional to contribute. Of course, lots of people also in law talk about the financial crisis. Much of that is a kind of technocratic debate. What can we do? What should we do? Where it's not always clear who the we actually is. Some of it indeed tries just to describe individual situations. And the question was indeed, can comparative law contribute something more? Is the fact that we in comparative law look at interrelations between laws and legal systems, is that kind of focus on interrelations possibly also helpful for the comparative questions and the governance questions involved in the theme? And I think we found from the responses to the call for papers that indeed that is the case, that we in comparative law have exciting and things to say about the topic of financial crisis and sovereignty that go beyond much of what we read elsewhere, not only in the media but also in academic contributions. We chose 3 papers for the panel, and each of the panelists will speak for something like 10 or 15 minutes, but we've had many more interesting contributions, and I hope that we'll have a lot of input also from the group here, because really this is an occasion for us as comparative lawyers to discuss amongst ourselves how we can, as the comparative law community and with specific tools and instruments of comparative law, make sense of the theme of the day. The 3 panelists that we have we start with Fernanda Nicola, whose slides are up again, that's pleasing, who looks at specific uses of comparative law and comparative law methods for the European financial crisis, in particular, if I understand it correctly, the relations between Greece on the one hand and Germany on the other. We'll have Abdieh afterwards looking at not just comparative institutions, I understand, but also more generally whether legal history and comparative law are actually helpful to make sense of the financial crisis. And then we'll have Annelise Riles looking at governance implications and indeed the neglected discipline of private international law as another theme of this society to overcome the mutual incapacities of states and of markets in the face of the financial crisis. And after that, I hope we'll have lots of contributions from the room and additional viewpoints and actually have a discussion. And so I should stop and head over to Fernanda.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you for the Society for inviting us today here. What I'll do today is really the beginning of an idea or a thought that was really in my mind and then was solidified by the call for papers that Ralph sent out to the Society, and I think it was timely. Like what he did, the work he did with legal origins, where are comparative lawyers, I think the current financial crisis is calling for us to be there again. And that's what I was thinking in this paper. So the thing that I'm reacting to is really this idea that that there is the moral blame narrative that is very predominant all over, from European to American newspapers. The David Brooks quote, "The spirit of the enterprise," is very much in everybody's minds. Why are nations like Germany and the US rich? It's not primarily because they possess natural resources. Many nations have those. It's primarily because of their habits, values, and social capital. People who work hard and play by the rules should have a fair shot at prosperity. Money should go to people on the basis of merit and enterprise. So, this is the famous story of La Fontaine that pervades with the blame narrative. Also, Peter Lindsay had a nice post on Utopia called "How the Fault Narrative is Still Stronger Than the Shared Solidarity in Figuring Out What to Do with the Fiscal Compact." The other interesting thing is that in comparing different narratives for the financial crisis, Miguel Maduro also wrote something that it's telling how in the US the prevailing narrative was Americans blaming irresponsible banks while Europeans blaming irresponsible southern countries like Greece. The reason for this disparity is the scope and the level of politics under which the narratives are framed. In the US, the problem is seen as a national problem regarding the actions of banks and individuals, while in Europe, the problem is seen as arising within some states and affecting other states. And there you go with the pigs. And the name of pigs is very much agreed by everyone that those are the group of troublesome countries, those are the bad Mediterraneans, with Ireland being an exception, but they deserve the money of the bailout. So I think we have to do two things. One is to understand how law and the history of European integration has led us to this kind of narrative and why we let it do so. And then the other thing is to think about how comparative law methodologies could be used for alternative narratives that could tell us what is the relevance of law in society and in the crisis overall. So just to remind you a little bit that during the first decade of the Eurozone crisis, as my former colleague and friend Mark Pollock explained, that it was life on the beach, right? Convenience, low inflation, low interest rates, all the countries were doing great. The Euro seemed a great success for this kind of multi-level government that is the European Union. The crisis sparked in 2009 with high levels of debt, high budget deficits, high interest rates in bond market, not just Greeks, pigs, but also beyond. We know the French banks were highly troubled, and the question was how to respond. So we had quick responses, long-term and immediate responses that reflected the German view. The other view, I remind you, it was the whole Merkel-Sarkozy tension. The other view was the Sarkozy tension. Just let the central bank put out the bonds. Quick responses in 2010. 2011, finally, we have the six-pack legislation. And finally, the fiscal treaty, the famous fiscal treaty in 2012, really pushed by Angela Merkel, the idea that we need a new treaty to address this old issue, and we have a creation of a European stability mechanism, but also we have new rules in the treaty whereby law becomes more and more relevant. There is an Article 8 in the new fiscal treaty that talks about how the European Court of Justice is going to be now the monitor, the final arbiter that will impose penalties to the bad guys that don't respect the fiscal treaty requirements. So the responses to this have been, from all over, but especially Jürgen Habermas has written a lot, even a book about this, and so you have these ideas that the Eurozone is now is transforming the hopes of a post-national democratic dream into a nightmare, and therefore we have these democratic bureaucratic authorities led by financial instead of political leaders and economists especially that are telling us what to do. So I think that this is a nice analysis, but in all these we see Habermas is talking about the lack of democratic representativity, and I'm talking about the lack of legal discourse. Apart from, I have to say, Peter Lindsay's posts that have been, I think, very well read, there's been very little sustained by the legal community and comparative lawyers. And what has happened in European integration? What happened with this idea that European law was solving every nightmare, every problem, every issue? Europe was becoming such a model for high environmental standards, maintaining social welfare, and at the same time efficient markets. What happened? So where are the lawyers? So right now what's very much en vogue and trendy is Carpolani. Christian Jorges and Michel Everson have a great paper that starts using Carpolani to basically to show that we really have to talk about how markets are embedded in society, and law created some of this embeddedness by providing some of the technical tools that European integration required. So law offered tools, European integration strive with those legal tools, and ultimately the market was growing. And the narrative of the internal market was sustained at the same time with a strong narrative of European law and European constitutionalism. So right now, Polanyi is interesting because of the division between the fictitious commodities and the three different sectors, right? Land, labor, and money. So a study that Jorges and Michel Everson are doing is to try to understand EU law in light of the three different commodities that Polanyi is putting out there. Polanyi is also very much trendy right now because of his ultimate prediction of the collapse of the 19th century system by reestablishing the gold standard that destroyed the international financial system. But apart from that, I think some of his insights can be applied if you reread the Great Transformation right now, you'll see there's so much parallels to what we're experiencing. So I just want to rethink the basic internal market rules. How did law help to create this integration? What were the tools the law used, and why we have a differentiated impact of those legal tools, the tools that European integration used to create solidified internal market, and why this create a differentiated impact adopting the sectoral approach of Carpolani. So first of all, the idea that the European Union should create an internal market, and an idea that it was a market that would create benefits for all, right? As we augment the pie and we all share the benefits of the internal market, was very much based on basic constitutional principles on the treaty that was established an area without frontiers, where free movement of capital, goods, services, and workers, and then persons and citizens would move freely. And the other idea was really the principle of non-discrimination. You can no longer discriminate, and the idea was you cannot maintain local subsidies, national-based subsidies that will somehow create incentive to your economy at the expense of the other. Another key tool to understand, and I won't give you any more lecture on European integration because some of you know this, other of you don't need to know more, but it's to understand what negative and positive integration is. And after that, I will just finish with EU law, just to understand that there's two major trends in European integration. The negative trend, that is the European Court of Justice was doing dormant commerce clause, basic dormant commerce clause kind of actions that the US Supreme Court had done for over a century. The idea of striking down those national measures that are protective, right? They are an impediment to the creation of free movement. And that's the the negative integration done through kind of judicial, talking back to judicial review, through vertical judicial review, the European Court of Justice striking down protective national measures. The other tool was positive integration, European directive, European re-regulations. Every time we have a gap of diversities among European rules, we have these European directives that then become a beautiful model of transplantation and transposition into our national regimes. And we know that the difficulties to transpose this directive are just huge. And they create a huge variation in the internal market depending on which legal actors, which context they have to be combined. So the first two rules that you see there are basically rules used by the court to do its negative integration, and the other two are rules used by the legislature, the community legislature, to do negative integration. Okay, so I have analyzed in my work a lot of kind of differentiated impact of EU policy depending on which territories they are implemented in. So here's what I'm thinking. With a colleague, we are thinking to write this paper based on this comparative methodology to test both the differentiated impact and the different outcomes from Europeanization, triggered by both positive and negative integration. So we're taking the three sectors influenced by Polanyi. We're looking at environment, especially waste, labor, especially in the public sectors as a form of welfare subsidies, and capitals, free movement of capitals. What we're doing is we're looking at both positive and negative integration, positive as a form of re-regulation of the market, and negative integration as a form of deregulation of the market. And finally, we're looking at forms of compliance. Compliance in terms of penalties or incentives. Was complying with the EU for where you were, whether you were in Greece or you were in Germany, whether you were in the Peloponnese or you were in Northern Rhine-Westphalia, was compliance creating more incentives for the government to do something, or it created more penalties, more burden to the administrative capacities of the countries. And in terms of social perception, this created more resistance or more willingness to cooperate with what the EU was doing. So for now, we're using another insight that I think you might all know, maybe, that comes from Curtis Milpaut's work on Beyond Legal Origins, where he uses an interesting matrix to show that law has two different effects. He's looking at countries affected by the financial crisis, and he's looking at different effects of the law, depending on whether the structure of government, he calls it centralized or decentralized, or coordinate. It creates effects that are more coordinative or protective. And we think this is a very interesting approach. It departs from civil law, common law, to show that actually countries react differently depending how law has structured their interaction, the interaction of the country with the financial markets. So in a similar way, we think that we can structure a chart that will look at two things: positive integration and negative integration. And if you think about compliance as a form of penalties or compliance as a form of incentive, for now we're looking only at two of the three sectors that we're comparing, but it's interesting for us that, oh sorry, Germany has gone over there, Germany has been moved, should be on the other side. It's interesting that in the waste sector, what we've noticed that in positive integration, meaning how do we comply with re-regulation? And what we are doing, we're really looking at paths to compliance, right? Meaning infringing procedure for non-compliance with environmental and waste directives. And we saw that ultimately the Hellenic Republic and the Deutschland are not that far. They're both not so good in complying with the environmental directive. But the big interesting thing is that the outcome, as you see, that the non-compliance for Germany really means incentive. And in that case, it was an incentive for Germany, the non-compliance with many environmental directives, but in the waste case, we saw an incentive to adapt the German system, the system of lenders, to adapt it to become more collaborative with the EU model, transplanting the directive in a way to involve the lender in the legislative processes, whereas the outcome for Greece of positive integration and non-compliance with environmental directive was much more cost. You have to pay fines, you have to adapt, you have to change your administrative system. Your administrative system is not complying with what we're requiring you to do. Collaboration, send out reports to the Commission. Ultimately, penalties was the outcome. So what we want to show is that basically the way the internal market has structured, the way the law has worked in structuring the internal market has put always Greece on the side of maybe they were both complying in terms of positive and negative integration pretty well or not pretty well, but what's interesting is compliance meant two very different things. Incentive to collaboration, incentive to modernize your legal system, or incentive to use your administration in a different way, versus compliance for Greece meant penalties, fines, showing that they had to hire more people in the public sector to basically do the reports that the Commission wanted them to do, and so higher costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. First, let me begin by thanking the organizers of the conference, John, Adrian, and Alexander, for organizing what really is a great program, I think. Likewise to the programming committee and to Ralph for inviting me to participate in this particular panel. I want to frame the paper that I'm going to be speaking on in slightly broader context. And as I thought about that, I was noting that we're going to be honoring Alan Watson tonight. And so what I want to do in terms of the framing of the paper is to talk about the ways in which the analysis of how we regulate and respond to financial crises might intersect or not intersect with both the role of legal history, obviously one important sort of dimension of comparative law, and number one, and number two, the role of legal transplants. So that's not broadly the framing. I want to suggest basically counterintuitively that the analysis of the history of financial crises and the regulatory approaches we've taken to responding to them may do more for us in terms of understanding how to approach financial crises than legal transplants, which you might viscerally expect would be more relevant in the setting of financial regulation and financial crises. All right, so first then the legal history piece. So again, it seems relatively in a posit at one level, in the sense that financial crises tend to be characterized by distinct particularities of time and place and setting and circumstance. There are distinct modalities. If we look historically at different financial crises, there are distinct modalities by which the crises originate, how they proceed, when they peak, how we get out of them. So there are these distinct modalities. And there's significant variance in the complexity of different crises, with arguably the most recent financial crisis being a magnitude of complexity greater than any of the ones we've seen before. The closest we may have come is the bailout about 10 years ago of long-term capital management, which had the potential, perhaps, to look like the recent crisis, but was averted, in essence, before that. So given all of this, again, there's one way, and at one level, one might plausibly expect that the legal history, the analysis of crises and how we've responded to them as a regulatory matter might not do much work for us. My sort of question about that really arises from my teaching as much as anything else. Over the last 3-4 years, as I've had occasion to teach about the financial crisis and financial crisis regulation to students both in the United States and overseas, I've been struck by the extent to which literature that has nothing to do with the recent financial crisis was the most useful tool by which the students gained insight. So excerpts from John Kenneth Galbraith's The Great Crash gave them insight into the recent financial crisis in a way that a lot of the recent literature didn't. Likewise, writing on the Asian financial crisis, on LTCM that I mentioned, even on the South Sea bubble and the tulip mania, they in many ways sort of gave them an insight into it. So why might that be the case? Why would it be the case that this analysis of, again, legal history, of the history of these crises and how law and regulation have responded to them might have given this insight? I want to suggest that in part it's because that historical analysis forces us to abstract away from the particular modalities of the recent crisis or any given crisis, to ask questions about and to try and identify what are the fundamental characteristics of financial crises that we need to identify in any effort to either prevent a crisis or on the back end to respond to a crisis. So more on that in a moment, but that's the legal history side. So what about then the legal transplant side? Now, given the global nature of the financial crisis, given the externalities associated with so many important dimensions of it, naturally we might expect that legal transplants might have, a story of legal transplants might have a central role to play in how we regulate and how we respond to financial crises, and particularly the recent crisis. So the notion would be, in essence, that really it was in some ways a lack of harmonization and a lack of uniformity in our regulatory approaches to the financial markets that perhaps set us up for the financial crisis, but surely once it arose, as there was fragmented responses to it by different jurisdictions, that aggravated the crisis or allowed it to persist. And I want to suggest that, again, linking these two pieces together, when we think about what the historical analysis teaches us about the fundamental nature of financial crises, it turns out that story is less apposite. That legal transplant story is less apposite. So what then is the core nature of financial crises that we can take away from the historical analysis, echoing Paul's presentation from earlier and his reference to David Law's paper in the Georgetown Law Journal? Fundamentally, financial crises are dynamics of coordination. There really is, at the heart of them is a dynamic of coordination that we're trying to engage. There's been less attention to that, or less, I'll say, explicit attention to that perhaps than there might have been. And this can be explained by the tendency among scholars of law and regulation, like scholars of any other area, to have their hammer and only see nails. And so we have a tendency as legal scholars to tend to look for the nails, and the nails we tend to look for are what I think of as prisoner's dilemma type defection, bad behavior, defections from optimal behavior. And then what we tend to think about is, what is the way that we respond to, in the financial crisis context, these incidents of fraud? How do we respond to these incidents of excess risk-taking? Right? What are the regulatory responses to these kinds of behaviors? As it turns out, though, the historical analysis suggests to us that the common strand, the thing that cuts through these financial crises, is the need to coordinate expectations. How do we effectively coordinate the expectations of relevant market actors, be they individuals, banks, other institutions? How do we coordinate their expectations around an optimal equilibrium versus a suboptimal equilibrium? How do we coordinate their expectations around a pattern of investment rather than a pattern of divestment? How do we coordinate their pattern of behavior of lending rather than the tightening of credit? How do we coordinate the behavior around spending versus savings? Now, that challenge of coordinating expectations is assuredly impacted by incidents of fraud, is assuredly impacted by examples of excess risk-taking. Fundamentally, though, what makes a financial crisis or a financial panic or a financial mania, depending on what term you prefer, a financial crisis, mania, or panic, in essence, is this failure of coordination, this failure to effectively coordinate expectations around the optimal result. What then is the implication of that for the use of legal transplants? What's the implication of that for our ability to engage in this practice of, or not engage in this practice of legal transplantation? If the goal is to coordinate expectations, that exercise or that practice or that goal tends to be highly situational, highly context and case specific. So here the famous work of Thomas Schelling, the economist Thomas Schelling, on coordination games and coordination theory gives us useful insight, though in particular here with two of the experiments that he did on his students in New Haven. And then I'll give you my application of those, and I think it gives some insights into this challenge. So probably the most famous question that Thomas Schelling asks his students in New Haven in the 1950s is, if they were lost in New York City and separated from their friend, where and when would they find that friend? And assuming this is 1950, so no cell phones, not even really pay phones, or they don't have a dime or whatever it cost at the time. So there's no ability to communicate where would they find their friend. As a matter of formal theory, the answer would be impossible. You can't find your friend. As it turns out, of course, as I'm sure most of you know, 83%, I think it is, percentage in the 80s actually do find one another. Not only find the right place, but even find the right time. And the place is at Grand Central Station in New York at noon. So when I had the pleasure of being, and the honor really of being a fellow at the LAPA program under Kim Shepley's leadership some years ago, I was teaching a class at Princeton, and without any of that introduction, I asked my students that same question. In teaching them about coordination, I asked them, tell me if you were separated in New York, your cell phone battery is dead, or at the time at least I could say you have an iPhone and it has no signal in New York. So you have no ability to contact them, where would you find them? Lo and behold, I found, it may have even been the exact same percentage of coordination, but very close at a minimum. But of course, they didn't meet at Grand Central Station. They instead met where? Anyone? Starbucks. That's good, but there's too many of them. Anyone? Why Grand Central Station from New Haven? Don't be shy, Keith. Penn Station. Why Penn Station for the Princeton students? Because the Metro North train from New Haven ends at Grand Central Station. The New Jersey Transit train from Princeton ends at Penn Station. So for Schelling students, Grand Central Station was the natural meeting place in New York. It's because it was the destination point of their journey to New York. For my Princeton students, Penn Station instead was the example. Another example highlighting the same general point. Another question that Schelling asked his students is, he arrays a series of numbers across a horizontal axis. So it's, I think the first one is 7, but 7, 19, 129, so on and so forth, 7, 8 numbers. And he says to the students, if you all pick the same number, you get a prize, $10, something, whatever else it was. He asked the students, and again, high level of coordination around which number, the very first number on the left-hand margin. I, teaching, again, coordination in China, asked my Chinese students, you got these 7 random numbers, which one do you coordinate around? And they chose the right-hand number. Why? Because they were reading from the right to the left. And so we see in these examples that the context will impact the capacity to coordinate, the means by which we coordinate effectively. Broadly, echoing Jim's question from earlier, we can think about this as an issue of culture. And Richard McAdams at the University of Chicago has written extensively on the role of culture, the role of history, the role of social context in efficient and effective coordination. In the particular game theory context, we talk about this in the framework of salience, the notion of whether something is salient, whether something is a focal point. So the question becomes, in trying to solve a coordination dilemma or trying to solve a coordination game or address the need for coordination, a point that stands out, something that's focal or salient, is more likely to give a solution than something that is less salient. What does this then mean for financial crisis regulation? I want to suggest that this emphasis on salience, coordination, and hence salience, or culture, you can say broadly, has both institutional implications and substantive implications. Given limited time, let me just say a couple of words about the institutional piece, which is the focus of my paper. In the paper, I identify 4 factors that we might think of as determinative or important to determining the salience of certain institutions versus other institutions. So as we design institutions to respond to prevent financial crises and to respond to financial crises, 4 variables that might be relevant. First is familiarity. So a more familiar institution, an institution that we already, we have some sense of or some understanding of, may be more likely to create salient rules, to create salient mechanisms for us to respond to financial crises and to regulate financial crises. A second related variable, visibility. Now, we tend to think about visibility seems a little bit like familiarity here. The example I give, which will be at least familiar to some generations in the room and not others, is the Trilateral Commission. So for those of you who know what the Trilateral Commission was, the 1970s, very visible, but not very familiar. So in other words, everyone talked about the Trilateral Commission as basically controlling the world government and creating the Vietnam War and all other such nonsense, but it was fairly it was fairly hard to know much more about it beyond that. So that would be a case where familiarity and visibility are different. A third variable is singularity. Whether an institution is unique, whether a particular institution that we create to respond to financial crisis is unique or fairly unique, may have an impact on its salience and hence its ability to address financial crises. And finally, its level of authority. And we can think about authority here as having both dimensions of legitimacy, questions of legitimacy, and also dimensions of expertise. What's the level of expertise? Depending on where we stand as to these different variables, there may be implications for our institutional design choices in responding to financial crises. So, for example, in choosing between national and international institutions, there may be circumstances in which national institutions are preferable, and there may be circumstances in which international institutions are preferable. Likewise, in choosing between the creation of new institutions, as occurred in some countries in response to the financial crisis, as opposed to the repurposing of existing institutions, may also be a relevant variable. In the international context, the use of regulatory networks, as we term them, or epistemic communities, as opposed to international institutions, may also be impacted by this. So these are all institutional design choices that are impacted here. More broadly, though, and again, connecting it to my broad thematic framework, if in fact the way we respond to financial crises, the way we regulate financial crises, is grounded in culture, social context, history, and the like, then it may limit our capacity for legal transplantation. Echoing the first presentation, what's salient in Germany may not be salient in Greece. That need not have any normative significance, but as a matter of institutional design, it may be that what works in one setting won't work in another setting. Thank you.
What?
Everyone can see your passcode. Everyone forget the passcode, please, instantly.
Okay, can you hear me if I shout? Is this okay? Yes? No? Yes? Okay, good. All right, so I think it's just great that we're having this panel. I'm going to talk about some specific ideas, but the broader, larger point I want to make is just a plea to all of you to get involved in this field, because honestly, there is such a need for comparatists and conflict scholars in this field. Frankly, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, any point, context matters. That needs to be said about 150,000 times in this field. And anything that we have had to say about any other field of law pretty much is relevant here as well. But as Fernanda suggested, law seems quite absent from this field at first. And so just making law relevant, much less making comparative law relevant, is a little bit of a challenge. And so let me just give you two examples that I saw from the last 6 months of hanging out with central bankers in Tokyo as relevant problems that are on their minds, which they think has nothing to do with law, but of course has much to do with law and comparative law. So the first of these is their preoccupation with the Lehman crisis. So, in particular, with its effects outside of the U.S. So you may recall, especially the Europeans in the room will recall, that when Lehman was declared bankrupt, I believe it was on a Monday, but I might be wrong about that. But the day before, the business day before, Lehman London transferred every single bit of its assets, down to the last penny, back to the New York office. Okay, so when Lehman went bankrupt in London, in New York, the UK regulators marched into the London office and found that they literally did not have the funds to pay the light bill left. Okay, and so this event. And of course, there are certain conspiracy theories among regulators about the fact that there might have been some coordination between the Fed and Lehman about doing this and so on, because of course there was plenty of money to go around in the U.S., but not enough to pay Lehman's debts overseas. This event has now preoccupied regulators in all kinds of ways. From simple questions like, should we really share information with our counterparts in other countries because they may use this information against us by transferring money or putting up what they call a ring fence around their assets to make sure that we can't use them, to questions about how do you coordinate. That's one example. Another example that preoccupies them a lot right now is the question of so-called shadow banking. So while we're all busy with the G20 and trying to build beautiful international rules regarding how banks should be regulated and trying to harmonize, as you suggested, guess what's going on in the market? The hedge funds are creating services that they can sell, which are functionally the same as what banks are used to offer, and are cheaper and are totally outside our system of regulation. So, and this is not a marginal event. Now there are estimates that the vast majority of these services are now being offered by these so-called shadow banks, which are not outside the purview of international and national regulation for the most part. And this preoccupies regulators to no end. I mean, the sense is, wait a minute, we're spending all of our time talking about the G20 and exactly how to tinker with those rules and get everybody on board, but all the action is actually somewhere else. And the response, for the most part, among the regulators that I hang out with is, all right, this is a problem. Obviously, there's a crisis here, but let's just keep tinkering with our G20 rules, and then maybe we can expand them to hedge funds and so on down the line. But a sense of crisis about that. And the interesting thing about the shadow banks, of course, is that many of them are located in places like the Cayman Islands. And so you have an arbitrage of both across jurisdictions and of substantive legal orders. So it's a non-bank, it's a shadow bank that's not subject to the banking laws, and therefore arbitraging the difference between bank and non-bank as well. Okay, so what these regulators are really facing, if they could see it in the way all of us would see it, is a kind of diverse ecosystem of regulation, a sort of a mess with no overarching legal structure. They've got national regulation, often very much directly in conflict, and all kinds of efforts to apply one's law, so-called extraterritorially. They've got international regulation, which is sort of binding, but not really. So there's that mess, and often, again, in conflict with national regulation. They've got diverse international institutions, the IMF, the FSB, the ASCL, and so on, which are, again, kind of conflicting with one another in terms of their jurisdiction. They've got all kinds of non-state law. They've got regulatory bodies like International Swaps and Derivatives Association doing their own thing, and a question of how that relates. And all of this, I think, leads to a untheorized or unarticulable, from the bureaucrat's point of view, sense of a kind of intellectual and political crisis. A lack of tools for thinking about this kind of mess, which of course is what we all do every day. It's our main bread and butter. And in particular, back to the theme of this panel about sovereignty and financial regulation, a lack of ways of thinking about the nature of sovereignty in a context of markets that are changing so dramatically, as suggested with something like shadow banking emerging. And a sense that the market participants are always way ahead of them in this game, that the minute you create a regulation, they invent a shadow bank and so forth. Now, what are they doing about this? Well, they don't have very good answers. So the simple answer would be, let's harmonize, let's coordinate, let's try to build the ultimate international institution, kind of the WTO being the model. Maybe we could have something like that. But nobody really believes that that's possible for all the reasons that you can imagine. It's impossible to get agreement. Once you get everyone at the table, there's no way to reach consensus. Even if you do, you can't implement it nationally. There's no support for this inside each country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the other alternative, then, if you don't believe in international institutions that are binding is some sort of new governance type system, which is what the IMF and the FSB are proposing. So I'm not going to talk much about what this is. I think most of you have heard of this. Certainly it comes from the EU model. But the point I just want to focus on is this last one, that it's, again, back to Fernanda's point about the disappearance of law, that it's sort of substituting a sociological approach for a legal approach, that you're going to have naming and shaming, you're going to have communities of experts who will, kind of cajole one another in following rules as opposed to hard law. But, the fact of the matter is that there isn't a lot of faith in this either. There have been a lot of great critiques, and you've written one of them, about the fact that this doesn't work in practice for all kinds of reasons. And in fact, I just finished a big report for the Bank of Japan on the problems with new governance methods. And I showed it to my colleague Michael Dorf, who's kind of one of the champions of this, the inventors of new governance, and he said, why are you even bothering criticizing us? I mean, we don't even believe in it. In fact, I don't write about this anymore, and it doesn't work, and just don't waste your time. I mean, who cares if it doesn't work? So there's this sense of a real crisis, I think, of intellectual and political legitimacy around this stuff, which is experienced by the bureaucrats in terms of these technical problems of, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about shadow banking, and the fact that the FSB isn't really working in terms of new governance, but in fact is a much bigger problem of the kind that we in here could be talking about. I think of it sort of as a strategy of desperation, in the sense that what else can we do? In my interviews with central bankers and people in the regulatory authorities, at least in Asia, turns up all kinds of really dark humor about this stuff, with people suggesting that, of course this isn't going to stop the next financial crisis, so why are we doing it? Now, meanwhile, back at the farm, we comparative lawyers and public-private international lawyers have had shockingly little to say about all of this. And I mean, I think that there are various reasons for this. I mean, in private international law, traditionally, regulation is thought of as a public thing, and therefore, we'd rather focus on, Islamic marriages or something like that than talk about finance. And that also seems to be sort of the U.S. Supreme Court's view, that if you're going to think about, for example, the scope of U.S. financial regulatory laws, you're going to just think of it as a question of statutory interpretation and just leave out the comparative and conflicts analysis altogether. And actually, surprisingly little academic writing. I think part of this is just a lack, it's sort of the epistemic communities problem. There's a lack of knowledge of conflicts among regulators. I tell them that this field exists, and they were just completely puzzled. They can't imagine what it is we do or how you would even get to that level of complexity. And then a lack of knowledge of finance on the part of conflicts and comparative types. But actually, I think there's a lot that we can do here. So let me just try, in the 5 minutes I have remaining, to give you a bumper sticker version of this. And I'm happy to give you more, if you like, later. So for a long time, I've been studying how people in the financial markets, on the private side, regulate themselves. And it turns out that the details of legal technique are very, very important in these private regulatory systems, like collateral management. And what I came to learn as an ethnographer of non-state financial regulation, and not as a law student or as a law professor, because I never would have learned this in law school, is a kind of deep, deep respect for these technologies, these techniques, if you like. And I think of this as increasingly as the sort of as-if quality of a legal technique. If you think of the legal fiction that the corporation is a person, which is so reviled by the Occupy Wall Street movement, do lawyers really believe that the corporation is a person? Yes and no, right? It's not a person, but it will be deemed a person. And it's that complexity there which allows you to do all kinds of cool stuff. And I was interested in how people use that kind of epistemological complexity in markets to achieve regulation that sticks. Okay, now Ralph and Karen Knopp and I took a piece of this insight and really thought it through in a way that I had never done about how this could be applied to conflicts problems in particular. We were interested in taking a problem which theory and comparative analysis and political science and social theory, legal theory didn't seem to be able to resolve, which was the conflict between gender equality and culture, and showing how these techniques, particularly in the conflicts arena, could produce responses and solutions that were way more innovative, we thought, than what the theory itself produced. So we were really excited about legal technique as an alternative to legal theory. That was the point of our paper, I think. So, so now what I just want to suggest in the 3 minutes I have left, is that we could take the analysis that Ralph and Karen and I did in the context of, Islamic marriages and think about how the same kind of insight could work in the field of financial regulation. So as an alternative to world harmonization, the WTO on the one hand, or new governance, both of which don't work. And we talked in the paper about a bunch of moves that conflicts as a field has for dealing with achieving a regulatory coordination, to come back to Bobby's point, in situations where you have fundamental political conflict and you have no overarching intellectual or theoretical agreement, right? So the thing that's really interesting about financial regulation is you don't have a world in which everyone agrees anymore about any single theory, whether it's profit maximization or whatever, about how markets really work. And that's the crisis, right? So what do you do in those kinds of situations? And we talked about a couple of points. So one was this idea of just the basic conflicts point. Remember I said shooting fish in a barrel. Basic conflicts insight that you can split the question of jurisdiction or power from the question of choice of law, right? So the basic conflicts, day one of conflicts is to say, just because the decision maker has the power to decide to apply their own law doesn't mean that they should, right? And this is an insight that really can be quite powerful for regulators who are thinking about, should we put up that ring fence to begin with? Are the assets here? That shouldn't be the end of the inquiry. It should then be, should we put up that ring fence? In other words, should we apply our own law to this, or should we perhaps defer to somebody else? And interestingly, if you think that's wild and wacky, take a look at Section 921(9) of Dodd-Frank, which seems to, and I've talked to lawyers who are lobbyists for this, so I'm not making this up. Take a look at this language. The District Court of the United States shall have jurisdiction over these issues. Many people think that Dodd-Frank gives U.S. regulators the power or directs them to apply U.S. law extraterritorially. But if you look carefully, the lobbyists knew something about conflicts, and they said we have jurisdiction, but it doesn't say we necessarily should apply our own law to that situation. So they're ahead of us on that. The other thing that we talked about in the Stanford paper was the idea that conflicts allows you to slice issues, slice problems issue by issue and apply different laws to different aspects of a problem or different conflicts or different cases. So right now, you may have read that the Commodity Futures Trading Commission is in a big dogfight about whether or not U.S. derivatives laws will apply everywhere in the world. And banks, to transactions involving U.S. elements. And foreign banks are extremely upset about this. But they're thinking of it in an all or nothing way. You know, it either applies everywhere or it doesn't. Whereas the conflict approach says, well, wait a minute, who are the parties? What are the effects? What are the effects of this particular transaction? And so it's a much more sophisticated way of thinking through that kind of question. And so the bottom line here is that I guess we would think that the conflicts approach allows you to really build a kind of regulatory coordination from the ground up in a situation where we don't have agreement, we don't have an overarching theory. The last thing that I want to say is that this is already happening. So if you think of choice of law clauses in most of the derivatives contracts that choose one of the law or the other, that is an effort to coordinate through conflicts already, except that it's one that's driven by the parties. If you think of relocation of assets overseas or just simply booking transactions in other places like the Cayman Islands, that is coordination through conflicts. But again, all the power is in the hand of the market participants. And of course, one of the insights we learn in conflicts is, well, wait a minute, do we have to do we have to devolve that power completely to the market participants, or could we, as the regulators or the judges or the academics, think about doing some of that coordination work ourselves on our end, perhaps to other effects? And of course, there are many techniques for that. So my time's up, so I will stop. Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks. I think those were three dramatically different positions already. John is giving us 30 minutes. We started 10 minutes late, so I think that sounds about right. I would ask that instead of raising your hands, people who have not just questions but also comments, additional positions, etc., if you just come to the microphone and introduce yourselves very briefly and then say something, and we'll collect a number of things from the audience, and then I'll hand back to the panelists. And maybe everyone just say, we almost know each other, but still introduce yourselves very briefly, say who you are, and then make your contribution. Thank you.
I'm Louis Del Duca from Penn State Dickinson Law School. Let me first congratulate the people who chose this subject in the timeliness of it and the importance of it, and then congratulate the panel for a very interesting, stimulating presentation. You've opened up all kinds of questions and techniques here that might be utilized. I'm going to limit myself to just two. You certainly converted me wholeheartedly to the basic premise that you're projecting here, that will be profitable, useful, desirable to get into an in-depth comparative study of all of this area. And it hasn't been done, and it is not being done very intensively at this point, and it should be done. Secondly, on the as to specifics, I think to illustrate how my mind reacted to your excellent presentation, I look at the work that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is doing, and in particular, the work that they're doing on the subject of ability to repay, particularly in the context of residential mortgages. And that got my mind thinking to the distinction that was made by the panel between the difference in the causation resulting from subprime residential mortgage lending, which is one of the basic causes here in the United States, and then the comment that was made that in Greece, the basic cause seems to be failure to adequately budget, and so and the tremendous cumulative debt, etc. That raised in my mind a question of some empirical data that might be helpful. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau right now has a proposal that would make a requirement out of the policy that used to be routinely followed. That is, that ability, particularly on residential mortgages, but across the board, ability to repay would be one of the first criteria before the loan is extended. That was totally disregarded, as we all know, with the creation of Fannie Mac and Freddie Mac, and the desire to make the residential mortgages available across the board, regardless of ability to repay. So what is the Consumer Board proposing now? They're proposing that what used to be best practices in the banking business on ability to repay be made a requirement. Every lender would have to establish that in good faith there was an effort to determine that the particular borrower would reasonably be able to repay. That's not a tremendously burdensome chore that is being put on the banking industry, but it is now on its way to formal adoption. There are other things that they're doing, but my question is this: empirically, I'm looking for empirical data now. Why is it that the subprime residential mortgage cause of the collapse apparently is not as present in European countries as is, and of course the excessive spending of governments is the criteria. Do you have any empirical data why that occurred? Is it a fact that there wasn't that much amount of that kind of lending in Greece? I have a feeling and I'm through now. I have a feeling that the empirical evidence might show that in the case of Spain, there was a tremendous amount of subprime residential type lending, particularly with the vacation spots that Spain is so well known for. And there might very well be a combination of factors in the Spanish situation which may not be present. So empirically, that kind of data might be helpful.
Can I cut you off? Sorry, not to be impolite, just because there are not lots of people behind you.
Okay, I'm through.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. It's a good question. It's just, thanks.
Should I go next? Okay. This was a super panel. And I'll try to adjust the microphone so that everyone can understand me too. Okay. First, you all raised the question why I do not write about the fiscal and financial crisis, and the answer is simple. I don't understand it. I depend entirely on Paul Krugman when it comes to these questions. I don't understand it at a legal level too, because guess what? I've read the six-pack. And the six-pack comes in language that appears to be easy to understand. On the surface, it's easy to understand, but I understand also that only the people who are privy to these issues can make sense of it. So the interesting things about the regulations that we find on this level is that they are, in a concealed way, arcane. And that's a fascinating point for me, who doesn't understand it, who seems to understand it on a superficial level and cannot understand it when it comes to the issue itself. Second point, I want to make a second point too. The conflicts of law approach, Annelise, that you propose is still, in a sense, very reminiscent of the language and the realm of ideals that I encounter when I read about new governance. William Simons, we need not strict rules. No, we need something more imaginative. Rolling rules, rules that we adjust as we go along. You seem to advocate the same flexibility. And the question that I have, and I may now sound like Hayek. I don't want to sound like Hayek, but I may sound like Hayek, not only because of my accent. The problem is that if we assimilate law too much to spontaneous and flexible problem solving, we lose law. And when we still call it law, we conceal something. We conceal the fact that what we do is problem solving, administrative problem solving, pure and simple. Carl Schmitt's administrative state, no longer legislative state. I could go on and on, but I'm too late.
Keep going, it sounds good. I think I'll be a little briefer than that. The basic question I have is relates to how we conceptualize the interrelationship between these players. And I was surprised that the term convergence did not come up in that anywhere in the discussion today. And it seems to me that if you think about this in terms of the role of potential role of comparative law, that might be important. Because we're hearing a bunch of people talk about convergence, and either they like it or they don't like it, but they don't really think very carefully about it. I've been looking around the literature. You see very little careful thought about what convergence is. From a comparative standpoint, I mean, we can take, as comparative people, we can say, all right, let's look at this thing, begin to see what are the differences. Convergence means that you move toward a center. You can identify the differences among the players. Then you can begin to ask, well, what kinds of differences are they? What kinds of incentives are there for moving toward particular positions? At that point, comparative law becomes potentially a very valuable analytical tool, And I don't think it's been used that way yet, and I think there's a lot that could be done. So anybody who has any thoughts on that, I would love to hear.
Frank, can we move over to the one other mic really quickly? Sure. Great, Francesca.
Thanks very much for those presentations. They're great. My question has to do with the banking side of the EU crisis. So there's the fiscal side, which you largely talked about, Fernanda, but there's also the banking side, which really applies to both of your presentations. And what the EU has done is it's gradually ratcheted up its regulation of banking. So right after the 2008 crisis, you got the EIB informally acting to deal with some of the pathologies of the system. Then you get a more formalized system with the European Banking Authority in London. And then you get now the proposals for the European Central Bank to come in as a central regulator, essentially like the Fed, for Eurozone currencies. And the question is, whether the coordination or the choice of law approaches can offer us some kind of normative key to understanding whether or not this development is a positive thing or a negative thing. Whether it's something that really is necessary to prevent this kind of crisis in the future, or whether alternative mechanisms would be appropriate. And this is simply the constant response that regulators have to crises: enact more legislation, transfer more power. To Fernanda, the banking side actually raises the question whether or not actually Spain and Ireland are different from Italy and Greece. In that, people don't blame Spain and Ireland for fiscal imprudence, because the banking system collapsed much later, and so they had perfect fiscal order. And so whether this narrative of blame really is out there, or whether it actually is differentiated and has some substance to it.
Fine. Well, I thought all the papers were very good. My questions and comments are to Annelise. 2 questions, 1 comment. I'll make them quick. First question on the Dodd-Frank jurisdiction. I was wondering what your basis for saying that was deliberate, because what I've read from Richard Painter and others suggests that was an accident and a misunderstanding of the drafters. Second,
both of those things.
Yeah. Second comment, which is your suggestion that they use choice of law as sort of case specific. Does that depend upon a particular sort of second restatement approach to choice of law as opposed to a rules-based? Third, which is a comment and a suggestion in terms of research agendas, although maybe it's been done, which is that if you look at the Morrison case, it talks about conflicts in terms of substantive regulation. It doesn't actually talk about different approaches among different nations to the jurisdictional, I'm probably misusing that, or the choice of law principle, which if you're trying to get a coordination system which avoids either gaps or overlaps, would seem to be the relevant one, and that would seem to be the more important agenda.
Spectacular model for the brevity of the 3 last questions. Thanks, Frank. Go ahead.
So I thoroughly enjoyed all 3 presentations as well. My question and comment, I suppose, at the same time is prompted by Bobby's presentation, but really is directed at all 3 members of the panel. So, Bobby, you had identified these factors that we should think about in institutional design in responding to financial crises. I think they were familiarity, visibility, singularity, and authority, and you noted that to the extent that we tend to, let's say, inevitably be attracted to these types of considerations in designing institutions, or to the extent that we think a particular institution that has these that exemplifies these factors will have greater purchase in a particular culture, that calls into question the idea of transplantation from one national legal system to another. It occurs to me at the same time that these factors would describe very well the appeal that of the rating agencies, for example, to the markets in playing such a central role in the structuring of mortgage-backed securities. Right? They were particularly used for marketing, but you could also view the role of the rating agencies as playing a sort of informal governance role insofar as they were the gatekeeper to the marketplace. They were as close as we had to a real regulator, as it were, and the market fell back on them because they were familiar, visible, singular, and had a sort of at least epistemic authority, and arguably legal authority to the extent that they were incorporated into financial regulation. And then, of course, there's a public regulatory dimension to that as well. They were incorporated into regulations, which imbued them with some authority from the SEC and other similar agencies, that authority being both legal and epistemic in nature. So that suggests that at the same time that legal transplantation might be called into question by our predilection to look to these types of factors in designing institutions, that at the same time we might have to, they might prompt a desire to interrogate our own tendencies in institutional design, right, which might lead us back to foreign models, right? Even if these tendencies in terms of designing institutions that have real purchase domestically lead us to suspect that we can't just blithely translate a regulatory regime from one country to another. At the same time, these factors also tell us something about what led us down a very problematic path and might lead us to say, okay, in that spirit, we need to be thinking about what other countries have done in a more self-aware sense. And so that's the comment. I guess the question is, do you agree with that or not? And to the extent that you do, what are the institutions that we could use to help us do this?
Thanks.
I'll be so brief that it may even be stunted. One quick comment/question to Robert and one to Annelise. To Robert, so if we conceive of financial crises as essentially a coordination problem, then it strikes me that the task is to figure out how we get from one coordination equilibrium, the good one, to the bad one. As the question is about equilibrium change rather than, establishing an equilibrium where there isn't one before. And so typically there are two ideas about how we might get equilibrium change. Idea number one, exogenous shock happens. There's a war on and that war blows up the economy. Idea number two is that some equilibriums may be self-undermining. This is the Greif and latent quasi-parameters thing. And so I wonder, one, to what extent you have thoughts on which dynamic is at play in the financial crises and how that changes how we conceive of law's role. To Annelise, I think my thought echoes Sasha's in maybe a slightly different tone. That is, so we had, in your presentation, I took there to be some conceptual stuff about the potential for conflict of laws to play a role, and then there was one concrete example, and I understood the concrete example to essentially be, well, sometimes courts should decline jurisdiction. That is, sometimes law ought to get out of the way and allow regulators in this new governance spirit to talk to one another and to come up with these on-the-ground, built-up solutions. So I'm wondering whether your argument isn't so much conflict of laws, people or law in general should start thinking of this as law should get out of the way of the regulators.
Thanks. Can I ask the two last questions, because you lined up slightly afterwards, to do just 20 seconds? Here. No, it's fine. It's great. But
no.
So we give a chance to the panelists as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Luisa Antonioli from the University of Trento, Italy. Now, my main point was about Fernanda's presentation, but I think it's some relevance also for today's issue about judicial review, and it's about the impact of the European crisis on the constitutional balance between the states and Europe. Now, basically, the problem comes out from the fact that the euro was established as a single currency without having political economic integration. So the money was there, but political economy was still in the hands of the state. And the rules that were inserted into the treaty were not enough to keep the states under control, both in terms of public expenditure, public budget, and private budget. So the thing is, if we want to use comparative law, I think one of the most important things to see is that it's a state problem related to this supranational level. So the European Union is not a state. It doesn't have power. in the terms that, for example, the United States federal government has. And this has created a crisis. And the problem stems from the fact that the internal market was the driving force, and law has been somehow overburdened in terms of what it could do. And now that we have a political problem, Europe is not capable of reacting to that, so it comes back to the states. And there you have problems like the German Constitutional Court having to decide whether the fiscal compact is constitutional or not. And I think comparative law might give, I think, an important sense of what is happening in terms of relationship between different legal levels and also between law and politics in devising solution for crisis. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, last question, or last comment.
Three very quick points going to what Annelise says.
3 points in 20 seconds.
I think there is a group of lawyers who really are thinking about these issues. There are the private lawyers, one who are trying to evade the laws, but also the private lawyers who are trying to help corporations avoid human rights violations and avoid international corruption. Leading to point 2, they need a conflicts of law regime which allows them to say whose law they and their clients have to obey. So that's a need of the conflicts regime. Last point on public international law. The dualist regime that you see in the United States and many other nations where courts will not apply international law leaves a huge hole in this question of who has power over us as we sit here thinking of business.
Thanks, great. So we have had lots of questions. We don't have a lot of time for answers, so I give each of the panelists 3.5 minutes to respond to any or none of the questions and to just say your final words, and I think we'll go in reverse order. So I'll start with Annelise, and then Bobby, and then Fernanda.
Okay, well, thank you.
And there's no need to respond to every question in this context.
She can do it, Ralph.
You're free to say what you want to say.
All right. Well, those were fantastic questions, and I think a lot of them are related, so I can tie them together. So Sasha, first of all, on the question about you not understanding it, obviously your question demonstrates that you understand this perfectly. You know, as my mother used to say, everything is easy once you know how, and there's nothing, you know, if you can understand conflicts, it's harder, that's more complicated than this. So believe me, I think this is, but I'm serious, because I think there's an intimidation factor about this stuff that we really need to get over, because it's not any harder than any other field of law. But I want to go to your substantive point, which is a really great one. What is the difference between a conflicts approach and a new governance approach? Both seem to be about flexibility, coordination, allowing for plurality, blah, 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 blah. Isn't it the same thing? And I want to say no, it's not the same to me in an important way, but this is hard to explain. I'll only answer this. Is that all right? Okay, so the new governance approach is technocratic in the sense that it's not interested in law. It's saying, law schma, we policymakers, we're just going to get in there, roll our sleeves up, and solve problems. It's very instrumental. It's not reflexive or thinking about, you know, how does the problem look from another jurisdiction's point of view. It's just problem solving. And I think, to go to Francesca's point, there's a real question here about how we relate to this normatively. It's a power grab, and it's a lawless power grab, and it raises all kinds, at least in Japan, raises all kinds of interesting analogies to an ugly past in terms of the power of the state, and I think your reference to Hayek is completely appropriate, actually. And I say that's someone who, so what's the difference then? To me, the difference is conflicts is not technocratic, it's technical. And again, to Hayek, right? Hayek thought that the technicalities of law were non-instrumental in the sense they're not purposive. They're about, the technicalities apply no matter what your outcome is. They're blind to the outcome. They are technical in that way. Now, of course, you could say to me, come on, are you a formalist? I mean, don't you know that when a conflicts judge makes a decision about whether it's a contract or property, they're actually making a policy decision about whether they want the plaintiff or the defendant to lose? Of course. but they do it in a particular as-if modality. I will make that policy decision as if it were a blind decision. And to me, there's a difference there. And I'm drawing here on Hans Weihinger's work, The Philosophy of As-If. So and I think that that also goes to, somebody raised the point about Morrison, wouldn't it be great if the Morrison-type reasoning would think through how the problem would be addressed in another jurisdiction, right? What would be somebody else's take on the same problem? Now that is very conflict-inflected insight. Renvoi is about that, right? It's about thinking as if you were another jurisdiction, thinking as if you were, thinking through the problem from another point of view. And that is, I agree, a much more sophisticated and I would say even normatively valuable take that we as conflict scholars just take for granted, but that is lacking from that technocratic apparatus. Now, it doesn't mean in the end that we don't actually make policy decisions, but thinking through those tools gives you a different inflection, I think, than the new governance model. Maybe I'll stop there. Let me just see if there's anything else. The rest I can deal with privately. Thank you.
So I'll sort of speak first to the points that we were just discussing. So on your, Sasha, the framing of the flexibility question, sort of connecting that then to Annelise's response and then Francesca's question again about the normative payoff from this. I wonder whether one way to think about the utility with the conflicts approach, or maybe perhaps a coordination approach, what it adds to the new governance model is that it puts in place a set of meta rules, right, that sit on top of the technocratic or the problem-solving approach that maybe sort of at least buys us some normative payoff. Francesca, that sort of in some sense it's our confidence level in the consistency of these rules, the minimization of potential for abuse or the like, and again potentially the capacity to prevent future financial crises or address them lies in this meta rule structure that they place on top of the way in which. So I'm not sure, Annelise. I don't know that I would accept all of your characterization of new governance literature in the sense that it's not necessarily completely we're just solving the problem devoid of law and the law, at least as I read it. But it may be that what the conflicts approach, or again a coordination approach, adds is it puts this set of meta rules on top of that, so you have some normative framework for evaluating the way in which those approaches are used. So that was two of the questions. Then to Chris and Paul. So here the way I think about coordination from a game theory perspective is that it's a multiple equilibrium dynamic. So in other words, in essence, the task in a coordination setting is how is it that we fluctuate between these alternative equilibria, and is it spontaneous, is it exogenous, is it internal to the system, is it self-perpetuating as you suggest? So what I would say here is, and again, so starting with the answer to Chris, there's no necessarily normative claim to be found in this. In other words, you can find horrors you can coordinate around the suboptimal equilibrium or the optimal equilibrium, and bluntly put, you can disagree about which one is the optimal and suboptimal equilibrium. So for what it's worth, in the financial crisis context, the optimal equilibrium is spend, the suboptimal is save. Though plausibly we might have said 5 years ago or 10 years ago in the United States, the suboptimal equilibrium is spend and thing. But when we're in the midst of the crisis, it reverses. So I don't mean to suggest in this framework that if we do these things and identify these structures of salience, we then achieve good results. It makes sense to look at it, and it makes sense to constantly revisit it. When we think about the role of regulation in doing that, and then this comes to both of your questions, in some way, one way to think about it, we tend to think about the role of regulation in financial settings and other settings as being creating an equilibrium. How does it create an optimal equilibrium? But it may be as important a role for regulation, though very different than what we can conventionally think of it, as displacing equilibrium, right? So it may be that government doesn't know well enough to predict what the right result is, but government does know well enough to sort of be able to identify that there is some suboptimal equilibrium at the moment, and the task of government is simply to displace that dominant equilibrium. So Randy Pickard, Chicago, has written about the idea of norm seeding in the coordination setting, and he talks about the idea that, like a farmer, you plant seeds and you see if they take in a particular circumstance setting. So you might think about that as the way in which regulation responds to it. It's not exogenous necessarily or internal. Instead, the role of regulation is to displace, maybe even periodically, maybe systematically, every 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, displace the equilibrium to determine whether it continues to be an efficient one or not.
Okay, so my 3 minutes. I just wanted to say one thing, that the financial crisis has triggered much more interest for European law, which benefited some of us, European lawyers, and for this reason we're creating an EU law section at AALS, and Professor DeFaze is here with collecting signatures for the section. So it would be great if you can help us and have an EU law section in